Okay, so hello and welcome back, and this is going to be another shorter video that's just going to kind of pop up as at random. I might try doing these a little bit more frequently, but who really knows? So we're going to be talking about and revisiting a topic I've talked about a few times in a few different videos, but I feel this topic deserves its own shorter video because it's a topic that comes up a lot in the video that this is more mentioned in and gone into in detail. I haven't really watched that much, so I feel like I should just make this once so I don't have to continuously reference the whole concept of land grants and how they relate to the railroad. So part of the history of railroads in this country is that the federal government subsidized their construction through a backdoor method, which is giving them federal land in exchange for building between certain points. The purpose was that the railroad would be built between the 2 points by a set date, which would be privately financed, sort of. And when the railroad was completed, the federal government would give the railroad a set amount of land as specified in the charter of the railroad, and then the land would be sold to pay off the debt the railroad used to build itself, or a line or route or what have you. So land west of the Appalachian Mountains was divided into townships, which are 36 square miles, so 6 miles by 6 miles, and land was subdivided into square mile sections. As the railways were built, the railroads would be granted the odd-numbered sections on either side of the railroad for 10 miles in both directions. The federal government kept the even-numbered sections, and some of the land was given to the states to be sold off to fund state universities or leased sometimes, and these were the land-grant universities. Fun fact, I know some states, I think Texas is one of the bigger ones that still owns a large chunk of this land, and they use the leases and oil royalties to actually fund some of their state universities, at least in part. And a similar setup was used to fund K-12 education, so they got land to either sell or leased and bring in mineral royalties to fund education, which again, many states on the West actually still do have this land. I think Nevada is like the only one that has the least amount of land because they sold it rather than leased it over the years. What land the federal government kept was sold off for $15 for a 160-acre plot of land. A 160-acre plot of land sold by the railroads after they got land grants cost around $800, for example. People bought land from the railroads rather than get basically free land from the federal government because the railway was more invested in the success of the future farmer, since a more successful farmer was a more prolific shipper, which is what the railroads made money on, and they also did on towns, but we'll get into that in a second. To put this into a historical example, the Santa Fe Railroad was awarded 2.9 million acres in Kansas after being built from Atchison to Topeka and then across the Colorado border where it eventually crossed to Lamar. They eventually did this and became a continental-wide system, along with just getting their own little line. And this system was more or less used to help railroads build themselves over the course of the late 1800s, and frankly most large interstate railroads at the time did get land grants in some form or another. I know the Great Northern is usually hailed as being the one route that didn't get land grants, but one, it did absorb a bunch of companies that did get land grants on its eastern side of the system, and one of the railways they did get was chartered run to, I believe it was Billings, Montana, so like almost... was that like 2/3 of the way across the continent. They had a railroad that was chartered and had land grants as part of the charter. Yeah, they privately financed some of it, but it's not like they didn't have help getting there. So what these land grants did was bring new people into these lands, not only to civilize them, but to essentially build an American population to outnumber the Indians. So these land grants at least had a secondary life as being a vehicle for settling the land along with just financing the railroads. Railroads would generally designate some sections nearest to the track to be towns. This generally meant that they were set out at specific distances and generally had the same street plan. And the railroads did this to keep towns from cropping up in places they didn't want them to. And the federal government liked this because it meant they'd have privately financed outposts in what was once wilderness. But this meant that the natives were displaced, which generally meant they were herded onto reservations, which were on the worst land possible, and they were forced to assimilate into American culture, or at least try. The federal government, and let me no offense, never really had that good a success. Did a lot of damage, but as far as cultural assimilation goes, they were ultimately abject failures, other than in let's just say the more genocidal aspects might have worked some more successfully than the cultural genocidal aspects. And then this was generally done to rival tribes who were not farmers, and they were forced to share space with each other, which would mean conflict, starvation, basically then these didn't go well, which is kind of why the government stopped on the assimilationist policies, is because they realized they were failing, along with people having a different consciousness about treat other people. Basically, these policies were made at a time where we actually thought where people had different viewpoints on assimilation versus people mostly starting in the 30s having a completely different view on this up through the 60s. And again, this channel is not about the history of the Native Americans, so again, we'll be just kind of glossing over that. And to make this long story short, this ended up basically did destroy their culture, subject them to poverty, alcoholism. Not like the and formerly industrialized or rural areas that surround them. Thank you, deindustrialization and decline of our economy in some parts of the country. But anyways, this is just going to be the end of the supplemental video, and hopefully it's I don't know, it makes it so I don't have to constantly talk about land grants in every single video that some railway got them at some point or another. So yeah.